Welcome. I'm going to take about 5 weeks and do sort of a short series about fruitfulness. And then after that, we're going to move on. I think my plan at this point is to move on to a series on Abraham. All right. So what I'm doing for this series, fruitfulness is something I've thought about for a long time. And I just sort of have thrown some things together sort of hurriedly here, just to give me a chance to talk about some of the things I've been thinking across the years. And I'm going to do this in 5 sections. And today I'm going to talk about fruitfulness and faithfulness. Fruitfulness is a big deal for me, partly because from the very first year I got saved, I was really spiritually ambitious, you might say. I wanted to make a big impact for God. I ran across this quote that says, "The world has yet to see what God can do with one man who's completely devoted to him." And I was like, I want to be that man. And it wasn't that I was looking for notoriety or fame or something. I didn't care if nobody knew that I was being fruitful. I just wanted my life to make an impact for God. I was kind of hoping that maybe I would be like a Billy Graham and see all sorts of people saved. I was so excited to be saved, and I wanted to just bring all sorts of people to Christ, and that didn't happen much in my life. And I was so excited at other times to just really change the whole church. I mean, I just really had big spiritual ambitions, and I wanted to be fruitful. And what happened was sort of the opposite. I found that I was earnestly engaged in lots of ministry that outwardly seemed to have very little impact. There was just a lot of things that I did that I thought were really important and I thought would really make a spiritual difference, and then nobody really was interested. And so I did a lot of thinking about that, and early on that was somewhat discouraging. And somebody said near the beginning, they said something which was really helpful for me. They said, look, you just worry about being faithful. Let God worry about your being fruitful. So the thing I want to talk about today is this idea. You focus on faithfulness, let God focus on fruitfulness. Now, turns out this is a little controversial. I didn't realize that when I started putting this together. But for reasons that have, I think, to do with misunderstanding what this is about. And I am going to come back to this next week, revisit it a little bit, and revise it a little bit. But for now, there's a basic idea here that I think is really important that you probably thought about or heard about too. The idea is that fruit is up to God. It's not up to me. That's God's job, not my job. And I shouldn't spend too much time worrying about it. If I'm faithful to do what God has called me to do, I just need to trust that that is enough, that he will somehow use it in whatever way he chooses. And sometimes he may take somebody and use them in an extraordinary way, and he may take somebody else and from a human point of view, may not appear to use them at all. And that's perfectly okay because that's what God's job is. It's not mine. So there's this idea that what's really important is that I be clear on the responsibilities here. My job is to be faithful to whatever God has called me. What God has told me to do, I do it. And I don't worry about the results. And so that's the idea. Here's one of the verses that really brings this out. Paul is talking about himself and Apollos, and he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. He's using the analogy of farmers in a field and talking about planting churches and Christians. And he's saying, I was the one who planted the church and got people saved in the first place. And Apollos came along and watered and helped you all grow, but it was God who caused the growth. So then neither the one who plants or the one who waters is anything, but God who causes the growth. So the first thing you can see is that he's saying it's God who's doing the growing. It's not that if the church grows, it proves that I did things right or that Apollos did things right or that we're trying to figure out who gets the credit for that. We just did what we were called to do. And the second thing to notice is that different people are called to different things. He's not saying we both planted. He's saying I did one thing, Apollos did another, but God used us both to cause the growth. And then he says, now he who plants and he who waters are one. What he means is we're united. We're working together. We're not competing with each other, but each will receive his own reward according to his own labor. Even though God uses us together and we're working in unity, nonetheless, he will still notice what each one of us has done. But notice we receive our reward according to our labor, not according to our fruitfulness, but according to our labor, because the fruitfulness is God's part. Our part is just to have been doing what we're supposed to be doing as well as we can, as wholeheartedly as we can, as diligently as we can. And even that, of course, comes from God. All right. Another verse that is really important here is this one. Abide in me, says Jesus, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, so neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. So the idea again is that if I focus upon being fruitful, it may be that I begin to feel as though the fruitfulness comes from me. But it doesn't come from me. It comes from Jesus. I'm just a branch. He's the vine. And so it's more healthy for me spiritually to focus on being faithful and just leave it up to Jesus to bear the fruit, whatever that may look like. And the promise here is that I will bear fruit, whether I see it or not, if I am faithful to what he's called me to do. For 2 Timothy, this you might not think this verse applies as much, but it's something that's just been on my mind in the last couple of years a lot. So I've been thinking about it, so I'm going to include it. Says, in a large house, there are not only gold and silver vessels, but also vessels of wood and of earthenware, and some to honor and some to dishonor. He's using this analogy, this picture to say to Timothy, the kind of Christian we are can be different. One person can be a Christian who knows the Lord, and yet he's really not a very useful a servant of God, and another person is. He says, if any man cleanses himself from these things, he means from the things that would make us dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified, useful to the master, prepared for every good work. So the idea is that if we are faithful to grow in holiness and to abide in Christ and to live for God and to not let sin clutter up our lives and our hearts and our souls and our spirits, then we are ready and available and prepared for God for his use. Now, we're already clean in Christ because of his forgiveness of us, his pardon. But what this is talking about is the practical aspect of keeping our lives clear of the kind of sin that could get in the way. And it's saying if we have unconfessed sin just get in the way of our lives, if we have other kinds of things, that can sort of hinder God's being willing to use us. But if we will be faithful and focus on what we're supposed to focus on and be following God and abiding in him and doing what he says, we can be confident that we're a vessel for honor, that he will see us as useful and as prepared, ready for whatever he wants to call us to do. Okay, so what else was I thinking about? Some examples of people who were faithful but didn't necessarily seem like they were fruitful. One is Jeremiah. Jeremiah has this prophetic ministry that God calls him to, but when he calls him, he warns him, you're not going to find a lot of people listening to you. And as Jeremiah goes on, whatever he says, the people around him just don't seem to pay any attention at all. And he kind of complains about that to God. He's, God, why have you called me to be a prophet if nobody's going to even listen to what I'm saying? But that is part of his situation, his call. He was called. Other people were called to be prophets where people really listened to them. It really made a big difference. Jeremiah sort of the whole time just kept prophesying and most of the nation paid no attention to him. Must have been very difficult. But God didn't judge him based on how they responded. God judged him based on was he faithful to what he was supposed to be doing. Ezekiel's an even stronger definition. We'll look at an example. We'll look at him later on. Noah says he was a preacher of righteousness while he was building the ark. But we can see what effect he had. Only he and his family entered the ark. So he was, in one sense, seems like he was a pretty ineffective preacher of righteousness, but he was faithful to what God had called him to do. And that was the important thing. And the rest was God's responsibility it wasn't Noah's responsibility to make sure that people listened. It was just his responsibility to do the best he could to do what he was supposed to be doing. Charles Simeon, this guy I'd never heard of, but I was reading a book this week on grace, and let me read you what it said about Charles Simeon. It was talking about patience and faith when there doesn't seem to be much going on. Charles Simeon, it says, was in the Church of England from 1782 to 1836 at Trinity Church in Cambridge. He was appointed to his church by a bishop against the will of the people. They opposed him, not because he was a bad preacher, but because he was an evangelical. He believed the Bible and called for conversion and holiness and world evangelization. For 12 years, the people refused to let him give the Sunday afternoon sermon. And during that time, they boycotted the Sunday morning service and locked their pews so that no one could sit in them. He preached to people in the aisles for 12 years. The average stay of a pastor in America is now less than 4 years under average circumstances. under average circumstances. Simeon began with 12 years of intense opposition and lasted 54 years. How did he endure in such patience? And then it quotes Simeon himself saying this: "In this state of things I saw no remedy but faith and patience." The passage of Scripture which subdued and controlled my mind was this: "The servant of the Lord must not strive." It was painful indeed to see the church, with the exception of the Isles, almost forsaken. But I thought, if God would only give a double blessing to the congregation that did attend, there would be on the whole as much good done as if the congregation were doubled and the blessing limited to only half the amount. This comforted me many, many times, when without such a reflection I should have sunk under my burden. I just love this picture of this pastor just faithfully doing what he was called to do when there's so much opposition and so much of what he probably was hoping would happen just didn't happen. And yet his faithfulness as a pastor was really shown. Another example that I read about this week, and I had not heard of before, is William Leslie. Let me read you what I have written about him, what I've read about him here. It says, hold on. In 1912, medical missionary Dr. William Leslie went to live and minister to tribal people in a remote corner of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. After 17 years, he returned to the U.S. a discouraged man, believing he had failed to make an impact for Christ. He died 9 years after his return. But in 2010, this is almost 100 years later, a team led by Eric Ramsey with Tom Cox World Ministries made a shocking and sensational discovery. Ramsey and his team flew east from Kinshasa to Vanga, a 2.5-hour flight in a Cessna Caravan. After they reached Vanga, they hiked a mile to the Kwilu River and used dugout canoes to cross the half-mile-wide expanse. Then they biked with backpacks another 10 miles into the jungle before they reached the first village of the Yansi people. Based on his research, Ramsey thought the Yansi in this remote area might have some exposure to the name of Jesus, but no understanding of who he is. They were unprepared for their remarkable find. When we got in there, we found a network of reproducing churches throughout the jungle, Ramsey reports. Each village had its own gospel choir, although they wouldn't call it that, he notes. They would write their own songs and have sing-offs from village to village. They found a church in each of the 8 villages they visited, scattered across 34 miles. Ramsey and his team even found a 1,000-seat stone cathedral in one of the villages. He learned that this church got so crowded in the 1980s, with many walking miles to attend, that a church planting movement began in the surrounding villages. Apparently, Dr. Leslie crossed the Kwilu River once a year from Vanga and spent a month traveling through the jungle, carried by servants in a sedan chair. He would teach the Bible, taught the tribal children how to read and write, talked about the importance of education, and told Bible stories, Ramsey notes. Dr. Leslie started the first organized educational system in these villages, he learned. It took some digging for Ramsey to uncover Leslie's identity. The tribal people only knew him by one name, and I didn't know if it was a first or last name. They knew he was a Baptist, and he was based in that one city, and they knew the years. So here was somebody who thought he was a failure, and 100 years later, there's an entire network of churches that are launched because of the work he did. So that's a reminder to me that when I don't see fruit, God may still be able to bring it in ways that I'm never even aware of, and that's encouraging. All right, what else did I want to say here? As I said, I just sort of jotted a bunch of notes down. Oh, I had some thoughts about why we don't see fruit, why God doesn't make it obvious. Sometimes it's just a matter of the right season. Jeremiah preached in a season when it wasn't the time for fruit. Israel wasn't at that place. Ecclesiastes 3, remember, says there's a appointed time for everything, and there's a time for every event under heaven, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to tear down, a time to build up, and so on and so on. Sometimes we are working in an era and in a place where there's just not much happening in terms of visible fruit, because it's instead God is doing something different, and that's just sometimes the case. We still bear fruit, and we still are to bear fruit even out of season, but we may not see it. John 4:35-38 is really interesting. Oh, I don't have that listed. Okay. That's the verse we use for harvest time. It says, "Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look in the fields, for they are white for harvest." But after that, Jesus says this: "Already he who reaps is receiving wages and is gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in this case," Jesus says, "the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap for that which you have not labored. others have labored and you've entered into their labor. What he's saying is, you are reaping the benefits of the sowing that the generations before you already have done. They were sowing and they weren't seeing all this fruitfulness till I showed up, and I'm here as the Messiah, and now we are reaping the things that they have sown. And sometimes God uses one person to lay the groundwork and to prepare the soil and to make people ready, and then he uses another person to really find the results. One plants and another waters, but also sometimes one tills the soil and another plants. And so you may live in a season when you're just doing the tilling of the soil, and you may not be seeing a lot of fruit, because that doesn't mean you're not being used by God. It just means it's hard to tell. Okay. Sometimes God just wants to remind us that we need to trust him only for fruitfulness. He just wants to remind us that we can't create fruitfulness on our own. Zechariah 4:6 is a verse I'm sure you know well. It says, "Not by might nor by power, but my spirit, says the Lord of hosts." Psalm 27 says, "Some boast in chariots and some in horses, but we will boast in the name of the Lord our God." And and Jericho is a picture of this. For 7 days, they just walked around the city and didn't conquer anything. And then when they finally blew the trumpets on the last day, all the walls fall down. Sometimes God sets things up so that the work we do seems to be making no difference, so that he can make the difference at the last moment and show his own glory, show that it's by his power, show that it's by his spirit. And he wants us to see how little it really has to do with us. And for that reason, he may call us to be faithful in service which doesn't seem to be bearing fruit. And then this verse, "Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchmen keep awake in vain." So if I'm a laborer, I should labor faithfully, build the house, but I should trust in the fact that it's God who makes it really useful, significant. If I'm watching the city, I can keep awake. That's not in vain, but if the Lord doesn't invest, if the Lord isn't in it, then it will be in vain for me. So God sometimes has us go through periods of fruitlessness, apparently. They're usually not really fruitless, but they look fruitless because he's reminding us that it's not about us, it's about him. Why else might we not see fruit? Well, frankly, and this is part of what happened in some of these seasons, people reject the message we bring. They reject the love we show. They reject the service we give them. Remember the parable of the soils, where Jesus says the sower goes out to sow, and he sows the word, and he sows it in all these different places. And sometimes it makes no impact at all, and then other times it makes a lot of impact. And it's not because the sower was doing a better job. It's because the soil was more open. And Jesus teaches this partly about people's response to his message. So even Jesus, the most perfect sower of the word, had people who didn't respond at all, didn't understand it, didn't really pay attention to it, didn't really follow it. And so certainly there are times when the reason we're not being fruitful is just because people aren't responding to the message. This is what God told Ezekiel would happen. He said, "I've sent you to them who should listen to you, yet the house of Israel will not be willing to listen to you, since they are not willing to listen to me. Surely the whole house of Israel is stubborn and obstinate. Behold, I've made your face as hard as their faces, and your forehead as hard as their foreheads." He says, you're going to find a very stubborn and obstinate audience, so I'm going to make you a stubborn and obstinate preacher. And you're going to find, and prophet, you're going to find that I will give you the strength to keep speaking even when they keep rejecting what you say. Now, sometimes the reason we don't see fruit is because we're looking for the wrong thing. In America, everything happens by being bigger and faster and louder. It's the huge spectacular events that get really noticed. And that sometimes gets imported into our spiritual thinking. We look at the mega churches, we look at the big events, and we think, we want bigger, faster, louder if it's really going to be spiritually effective. But God is often working through what's smaller and slower and softer. Sometimes the fruitfulness is happening not in the big events we have and not in the spectacular stuff we have, but just in quiet, slow growth and quiet, slow service, and not making a big splash anywhere. And yet it's still fruit. It's just that we don't tend to see it. And last, I think there's a lot of times when we aren't fruitful, really aren't being as fruitful as we thought, because we're just not ready yet. God is still preparing us. Fruitfulness in the long run, it springs from Jesus, but as he works through us, it springs from character. It springs from our being the kind of people that we're trying to talk about. Luke 16:10 says, "He who's faithful in little things will be faithful in big things." And in the context, he talks about people who've been faithful in little things being given more responsibility. And sometimes God is just still teaching. When I was first saved, I had these big ambitions, but a lot of the things I thought I was doing for God were actually just ways God was teaching me, training me, helping me to become more truly a servant, more truly for living in Him. 2 Timothy 2:21, I read at the beginning. If a man cleanses himself from these, he becomes a vessel useful to the master, prepared for every good work. Sometimes we're not seeing fruit because, frankly, we still have lots to learn. I remember one time in particular when God was impressing me with a sense of call for my life. And I was like, yeah, what do I do next? And he said, you wait for 10 years while I teach you a lot more about character, because you're not going to be able to bear the fruit I want if you don't have more character. And that's what needed to happen at that point in my life, is not huge successful ministry, but just changing the kind of person I was, letting God change the kind of person I was so that I could be more fruitful because I'd be more ready for it. Somebody once said, you deepen your message, let God broaden your ministry. If I will deepen my message, make sure I have more really to say, make sure I'm closer to God, make sure I'm following more faithfully, then I can depend on God to bring fruit and to broaden my ministry as he wishes. Okay, so you focus on faithfulness, let God focus on fruitfulness. If you're worried about evangelism, go ahead and be faithful to share the gospel with those who are open to it, but let God focus on whether people respond. If you're raising children, you be faithful as a parent to live the love of Christ for them and to raise them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. But it's up to God to take responsibility for how they respond. That's not your responsibility. If you're leading a ministry or teaching a Sunday school class or organizing a service project, you be faithful to do what you can do. I'll be faithful to do what I can do. And there will be times when it doesn't look like it's being fruitful, and other times when there's a lot of fruit. But we just need to be focusing on our being faithful. Now, as I said, next week, I'm going to go a little further with this, hit some other sides to it. But for now, that's what I wanted to say. I will see you next week.